When the prophet is using the critical voice, the intention of the prophet is to point out the injustice and oppression that the powers that be in ancient Israel were wreaking in their world. That voice is pointed at the priestly class and the kingly class, at the military, at the people with power in ancient Israel, who created and perpetuated systems of oppression and injustice. On the other hand, that energizing voice was directed at people who were oppressed. Obviously, the prophet did not want to energize the oppressor nor criticize the oppressed, but wanted to comfort the people who were oppressed, the people who found themselves hungry every day. The hungry, the sick, the poor. In the structure of ancient Israel, this would also include people who didn't find themselves in a household. So we often hear the prophet talk with comforting words towards the widow and the orphan. These are the people to whom the comforting, energized voice of the prophet is directed. The prophet said, "Just as a mother will not forget her children, so God does not forget you." These words meant to remind these people that they are not alone. They have not been forgotten by God. And in some cases, this definition of who is oppressed extends beyond, even to victims of violence. If you do go home and read the book of Amos, as Ruth has suggested, you should be ready. It is not a pretty picture that is painted by the prophets. The book talks of people who are raped and murdered, people who are the victims of incest, victims of violence, also are to hear the prophet's energizing, comforting voice. God has not forgotten you. Now, when I look at my own life, I know that as a woman, and especially for some reason as a woman in the church, I have experienced sexism. I have experienced oppression as a woman. But I always have to bundle that together with the fact that I'm a white woman, and I'm a straight woman. I'm a woman with education, and I'm a woman who lives in America. And so the kind of oppression that I have experienced as a woman is very different from that which would have been experienced by a woman of color, or a lesbian woman, or a woman with a lack of education, or a woman living in any other part of the world, especially not in the first world. This kind of exercise, I think, is helpful for you and for me to figure out exactly who we are in the world and what our relationship is to oppression and to those who are oppressed. Now, my husband, David Roberts Moser, will tell you that we had to do this all the time in seminary, having gone to the big bastion of social justice seminary that is Chicago Theological Seminary. And when David would do that kind of self-inventory, well, then he would find that he's a man who is straight, who's middle class, and who's getting his master's degree, so he has a lot of education, and he's an American. And then he would find himself here in the land of the oppressor. Now look at my nice husband. Does he look like an oppressor to you? Not really. But that's always my question, right? When we start to take stock of who we are, and we find that we don't squarely fit in the category of those who are oppressed, does that really mean we belong here in the category of those who are the oppressors? Is that really who the prophet's voice is directed too. I have to tell you, unless you all are moonlighting as politicians or CEOs, and you have a lot of power that you wield in the world, then at first my answer would be no. No. The prophet's critical voice is not directed toward you. All it does is make us feel guilty. Marcus Borg talks about having that emotion, having read the prophets, that it instilled in him a big sense of guilt. I am responsible for everything that's ever gone bad in the world. I am sorry. I feel guilty about that. Well, I must tell you that guilt is a useless emotion. It doesn't do us any good, and it certainly doesn't do oppressed people any good. They don't want our guilt. But the question remains, if we find ourselves here between the prophetic voices, what is the prophet's word for us today? First, we must recognize that there are those among us who experience oppression every day. Because of our gender, because of our sexual orientation, because of our education or lack thereof, because of our race. There are people among us, and people certainly in this community, who experience injustice every day. And so the prophet calls to us as a people to remind them that they are not alone. To stand with the oppressed, with the poor, with the downtrodden, with victims of violence, with people who find themselves on the margins of society. We are called to stand with them so that they would not be alone. And at the same time, I think as we're wrestling with this question of what the prophet's word is for us today, we have to remind ourselves where we really are in relation to the critical voice of the prophets. And whereas, as a middle-class person living in the middle of America, I don't have a lot of power, in terms of the global village, I have so much power, and so do you. If we drive a car, and if we eat every day, we have so much more than the majority of the world. And so every time you go to make a purchase, know that you wield power with that purchase. What we buy and what we do not buy is a way of perpetuating or benefiting from systems of oppression. Or it's a way of resisting those systems of oppression and standing in solidarity with people who are poor. Every time you vote in elections that are not corrupt, you wield power. Every time you join your voices with other people to raise awareness in our community and awareness in this world, you wield power. Every time you sit down to eat and you give thanks to God for the food that is in front of you, for the hands that worked to produce that food and to bring it to your table, and you pray for the hands that will not have food to eat this evening, you wield power. As we find ourselves between these two prophetic voices, we find ourselves with power. We find ourselves responding to the prophet in ways that can change the world, in ways that can continue to turn this world towards God's dream of greater justice and mercy for this world. Find yourself between the voices of the prophets. Find yourself there and move. Move in ways that create a whole and healthy world for all people. Amen? Amen. Let us be together in this moment of silence.